The keys are already in the stranger's hand. I'm standing on my own gravel driveway in a hospital bracelet, 31 hours out of anesthesia, watching a man in a golf polo test the weight of my front door key on his ring like it's a coin he's deciding whether to spend. There's a red and white sign staked into the grass by my mailbox. Sold is stamped across it at an angle, like whoever hammered it in was in a hurry. My forebruise is still yellow-green at the crook of my elbow. The air smells like cut hay and diesel from the moving truck idling at the end of my own driveway, and I don't recognize a single box coming out of my own house. Nobody has told me anything yet. That's the part that will matter later. Not the sign. Not the truck. The silence that came before it. Welcome to calm revenge tales, where the loudest people in the room don't always win, and where quiet costs less than you'd think, if you're patient enough to let it work. If you believe some debts get paid in full, whether or not the person who owes them agrees to it, subscribe and stay a while. This one takes time to tell right, because it took me a long time to understand it myself. My name is Josephine Vantries. Everyone who matters to me calls me Joe. I'm a large animal veterinarian in Christian County, Kentucky, and I've spent the last 9 years with my arm inside cows at 4 in the morning, so that men twice my size could keep their herds alive through calving season. I built my practice out of a used truck, a payment plan on an ultrasound machine, and a willingness to answer the phone at 2 a.m. without complaining about it. By 31, I had 40 acres and a farmhouse with a wraparound porch, paid for with my own signature on my own loan, co-signed by nobody. My grandmother Vera married a man named Emmett Louvier when I was 6 years old. He wasn't my blood. My family made sure I understood that distinction early and often. Emmett had been a diesel mechanic his whole life, hands permanently stained at the knuckles no matter how hard he scrubbed. And he talked slow, in the way of men who've learned that most things don't need to be said twice. My mother called him Vera's husband. Never Emmett. Never Pop Pop. My father shook his hand at holidays with the kind of grip that ends a conversation before it starts. I called him Pop Pop Emmett. He taught me to check a heifer's temperature before I could reliably tie my shoes. When Vera died, the family sent a card. I drove 2 hours every other Sunday and sat at his kitchen table, the one with the cigarette burn shaped like a comma near the salt shaker, and ate whatever he'd made, and he never once made me feel like I was doing him a favor. He made me feel like I was expected. The invitation to the family Christmas came from my mother, Darlene, on a Tuesday in November, and it came with conditions attached like fine print on a contract nobody reads until it's too late. "We're doing it at the house this year," she said. "Your father wants everyone there. Chase and Meredith are bringing the baby." A pause, the kind she'd perfected over decades, engineered to let the next sentence land soft and land hard at the same time. "It'll just be family, Josephine. You understand." I understood. I'd understood since I was 6. "Emmett's not going to be there then," I said. "Not a question. He's not family, honey. He was Mama's husband. That ended when she passed." She said it the way you'd correct a spelling error. Efficient. Certain. "Besides, your father's asked everyone to dress nice. We're doing a family portrait for the mantle. Roy's paying for the photographer, so. That word did a lot of work in my family. So meant. Contribute, comply, disappear the parts of yourself that don't photograph well. I told her I'd think about it. I already knew I was going, because Vera used to tell me that showing up for the people who love you is the only inheritance that never depreciates. And some part of me still believed that applied to people who weren't supposed to love me back. The irony, and I didn't catch it then, not really, not until months later, sitting in a lawyer's office with a document in my lap. is that the portrait my father wanted so badly for the mantel never got taken. Not that day. Not any day after. I called Emmett and asked if he wanted to come with me. He was quiet on the phone long enough that I thought the call had dropped. They don't want an old mechanic smelling up their good tablecloth, Joe Bird. I want you there, I said. That's the only invitation that counts. He came. He wore a collared shirt I'd never seen before, ironed within an inch of its life, and he brought a pie he'd made himself, apple, the crust crimped by hand, because Emmett Louvier did not believe in showing up to a table with empty hands, even a table that had never once set a place for him without being asked. The dinner started fine. That's how these things always start. Fine as the calm before the specific cruelty someone's been saving up. My father Roy carved the ham at the head of the table, like a man performing generosity for an audience. My brother Chase's daughter, 11 months old, banged a spoon against her high chair tray. Emmett sat at the far corner, past the leaf extension, in the spot usually reserved for folding chairs and afterthoughts, and he made conversation with my sister-in-law Meredith about her tomato plants, patient, gentle, the way he was patient and gentle with everything that grew slow. It was my Aunt Patrice who said it. Third glass of wine, voice pitched to Carrie. I just don't understand why we're doing this every year. He's not even related to us. It's like inviting the mailman to Thanksgiving. The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when everyone already agrees, and is only waiting to see who'll say it out loud first. My mother didn't disagree. That was the thing I noticed. She didn't disagree. She refilled her water glass and looked at her plate. Emmett set his fork down. Careful. Deliberate. The way he set down anything he didn't want to break. I can go on and eat in the kitchen, he said. Won't be no trouble. 3 words. That was the first one. I can go. Not I should go. Not I'm sorry. I can go, like leaving was still, somehow, a kindness he was offering them. That's probably for the best, Emmett, my father said. Like it was a scheduling issue. Like it was about seating. I stood up. My chair scraped the hardwood loud enough that the baby stopped banging her spoon. He eats where I eat, I said. Or I eat in the kitchen with him. My mother's face did something complicated. Not anger first, something underneath anger, something closer to fear, gone almost before I registered it. I noticed it. I didn't use it. Not then. Josephine, don't make a scene. I'm not making a scene. I'm making a choice. I picked up my plate. Emmett, come on. I think the kitchen table's better anyway. More room for pie. Aunt Patrice made a sound like a laugh that had lost its nerve halfway out. My father's jaw worked side to side, the way it did before he said something he'd later claim he didn't mean. You want to throw away this family over the hired help. That's on you. He's not the hired help. He's the only one at this table who ever made me feel like I belonged at it. Meredith opened her mouth. I watched her get halfway to something. A word, a defense, an apology maybe, and then watched her look at Chase, and watched Chase shake his head, small, just enough. She closed her mouth again. Sat back down. The baby started crying, and everyone was grateful for the excuse to look at her instead of me. Emmett and I left with 2 plates of ham and his apple pie, uncut, tucked under his arm like a football. Nobody walked us to the door. My father called it a choice too later in the driveway, yelling it at my taillights like he was the one who'd invented the word. You're choosing him over us. Remember that. You're choosing. He was right. I was. The first winter was the hardest one, financially and otherwise, though I never once said that word out loud to Emmett, because he'd have tried to give me money he didn't have to hear it. I moved him into the spare room at the farmhouse in January, after his hip gave him trouble on the porch steps of his own place, and I never called it charity, and he never let me call it anything but rent, even though what he paid barely covered his own groceries. I picked up overnight emergency calls I used to turn down. I sold the newer truck and drove the 15-year-old one with the cracked dash instead, because the payment difference was $340 a month, and $340 a month was groceries and Emmett's blood pressure medication, and the propane bill in February. My mother called in March. Not to apologize. To offer. Your father and I were talking. We could help you out. The practice, the house, whatever you need, if you'd just come to Easter. Just Easter, Josephine. Without him. No, I said, and hung up before she could restructure the offer into something that sounded kinder. She called again in June with a different number attached. She'd talked to my father's accountant, she said. There was a way to fold my practice's tax filing into theirs, save me real money, if I'd just distance myself a little, just publicly, just enough to stop embarrassing everyone at church. I said no to that too. Emmett never asked what those calls were about. He always seemed to know. The way he knew when a storm was coming from the particular stillness in the air an hour before the sky changed. On the nights after those calls, he'd start something on the stove without asking if I was hungry. Dumplings, usually. Vera's recipe, he said, though I noticed he never used a recipe card. He kept everything in a small tin box on top of the refrigerator, dented at one corner, the kind that used to hold a dozen shortbread cookies from some Christmas 30 years gone. He'd take it down sometimes at night, and sit with it at the kitchen table with his glasses on. And I'd ask what he was working on and he'd say, "Just some old business, Joe Bird. Nothing that needs your worrying about it." And I'd let it go. Because a man who'd given me a home when my own family wouldn't had earned the right to a little privacy about a tin box. The dumplings were the best thing I ate all year. He rolled the dough thin as paper on the same table with the comma-shaped burn, cut it into rough squares with a pizza cutter, because Vera's biscuit cutter had gone missing decades back, and dropped them into stock that had been simmering since morning. Chicken bones and a bay leaf and black pepper he cracked himself instead of buying pre-ground. Vera always said the secret's not letting it boil, he told me, stirring slow, patient, unbothered by anything as urgent as heat. Boiling toughens everything. Even dumplings. Even people. I think about that line more than almost anything else he ever told me. If a story like this one has ever mattered to you, if you've ever chosen the person the room wanted you to abandon, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because the next part of Joe and Emmett's story is the part where you won't know for a while whether the choice was worth what it cost. Subscribe now, so the rest of the story finds you. He kept the tin box on the refrigerator through that whole year, and into the next. I stopped asking about it. Some things you let a person keep private, especially when they've given you everything else. Emmett died on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting in the porch chair with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. His heart simply finished with the work of 81 years of being a good and steady man. I found him when I came back from a farm call. I sat with him for 40 minutes before I called anyone, because I wasn't ready to let the world know yet, and make it real by saying it out loud. My family sent a card to his funeral. Flowers, actually this time. A small arrangement, white carnations, the cheapest kind the florist carried, with a card that said, "Our thoughts are with you," and nothing else, not his name, not mine. I put the arrangement in the church anyway. Emmett wouldn't have wanted me to make a scene about a bouquet. I brought the tin box home from his room and set it on the shelf above the stove, in the spot where he'd always kept it, and told myself I'd go through it eventually, when I could stand to. 6 weeks after the funeral, I had an emergency appendectomy. Sharp pain on a Thursday night, in surgery by Friday morning, and because my emergency contact card was still years out of date, still listing my mother's number from before Emmett, from before any of it, the hospital called Darlene Vantries to let her know her daughter was under anesthesia, and would be for the next several hours. I don't know exactly what happened in those hours. I've had to reconstruct it since, from documents, and I'll tell you honestly, some of it I still can't fully explain, except to say that grief makes people either better or worse, and my parents had already shown me, years before, which direction they went. What I do know is this. In 2019, when I first bought the farmhouse, my father had co-signed a small bridge loan for 3 weeks while my mortgage cleared, a favor at the time, and a real one, and I'd signed a power of attorney limited to that transaction, so he could act on my behalf with the bank if I was out on an emergency farm call during the closing window. The loan cleared in 3 weeks. Nobody ever filed the paperwork to revoke the power of attorney. It sat in a drawer for 6 years, expired in every meaningful sense but never legally dead, like a gun nobody remembered was still loaded. While I was under anesthesia, unable to answer my phone, unable to say a single word in my own defense, my father drove to a title company 40 minutes from my house with that 6-year-old document, and a buyer he'd apparently been quietly courting for months. A developer named Garrett Muncie who wanted my 40 acres for a subdivision he was calling Hollow Creek Estates. My father represented himself as having full authority to sell on my behalf. The house, the barn, the 40 acres Emmett had helped me fence, post by post, the summer before his hip went bad. $428,000. That was the number on the closing document. $428,000, wired to an account, and I would learn later, split 3 ways before I even woke up from surgery. 1 share to my parents, 1 to my brother Chase, who'd apparently been struggling with a business loan he'd never mentioned to me, and 1 held in trust, they'd call it, though I'd come to learn that word meant something very different to them than it meant to a court. I woke up from surgery in a recovery room, groggy, my mother's face the first thing I saw, and I remember thinking, distantly, through the anesthesia fog, that it was strange she'd come. I remember her holding my hand and saying, "You just rest, honey. We took care of everything." I thought she meant the hospital bill. 31 hours later, I was standing on my own gravel driveway in a hospital bracelet, watching a man in a golf polo test my house key on his ring, a red and white sold sign staked in my own front yard, a moving truck already half full of boxes that were not packed by me and did not belong to anyone I recognized. That's where we started this story. Now you know the rest of how we got there. I didn't scream. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the scream, and I didn't have one in me. I asked the man in the golf polo very calmly, whose truck that was and whose signature was on the paperwork, and when he told me it was Garrett Muncie's crew and the sale had gone through cleanly 3 weeks prior, I asked him, just as calmly, to stop loading anything else until I'd made a phone call. I called an attorney named Corinne Ashworth, who my clinic's accountant had recommended once for a contract dispute with a feed supplier. I described what I was looking at in my own driveway. There was a long pause on the line. "Get everything you can find," she said. "Every document your father has ever had your signature on. And Josephine, do you still have anything of your step-grandfather's? Papers, files, anything he kept?" I thought of the tin box on the shelf above the stove, sitting in a house that, as of that morning, technically belonged to a stranger and a shell company called Hollow Creek Estates LLC. I hadn't opened it since the day I brought it home from Emmett's room. That night, sitting on the tailgate of my truck in what used to be my own driveway, because the golf polo man had, at least, let me collect what I needed before locking up. I opened the tin box for the first time. Inside, folded in thirds and yellowed at the creases, was a Kentucky revocable trust document, notarized 18 months before Emmett died, naming a legal entity called the Louvier Vantries Family Trust. Behind it, a deed. My deed. The farmhouse and all 40 acres transferred by Emmett, using money from Vera's life insurance policy that he'd never spent on himself, not once, not even for his own hip surgery, which he'd instead put off for 2 years, into that trust, with a single named beneficiary. Me. Dated the same month he'd started keeping the tin box up on the refrigerator, the same month he'd started disappearing into it at the kitchen table after my mother's phone calls. He'd quietly paid off the balance of my mortgage through the trust, and had the property retitled in the trust's name, protecting it permanently from exactly the kind of thing that had just happened to it. He'd never told me. I think now that he didn't tell me because he knew that if I understood what he was protecting me from, I'd have to understand why. And he didn't want to spend our last good year together making me carry that particular fear. There was a third document in the box. A letter, in his slow, careful handwriting, dated the week before he died. Joe Bird, if you're reading this, it means I finally worked up the nerve, or something happened to me first. Either way, this house is not your family's to give or take. It never was, not after what I did with it. Nobody sold you anything you weren't already given free and clear. You gave me a place at your table when nobody else would. And I'm not the kind of man who forgets a debt like that. This isn't charity. It's rent. Same as you kept telling me, all those months, except I paid it the only way I had that mattered. Don't let anybody boil this down to something smaller than it is. Ele. My father had sold a house he never owned. The meeting happened 3 weeks later, in Corinne Ashworth's office on Main Street. A room too small for how many people were crammed into it. My parents, my brother Chase, Meredith, the developer Garrett Muncie and his own lawyer, and me sitting closest to the door, with the tin box on the table in front of me like a piece of evidence in a trial that had already, quietly, been decided. Corinne laid it out plainly, the way lawyers do when they've done this 100 times and know exactly how it lands. The power of attorney my father used had expired in every practical sense in 2019, tied to a single, completed transaction. The property he'd purported to sell had, in fact, been held in an irrevocable trust for 18 months prior to the sale, entirely outside his authority or mine to sell, gift, or encumber. The sale to Hollow Creek Estates LLC was void from the moment it was signed. $428,000, wired, split, and already partially spent, now sat at the center of a fraud claim that named my father as the party responsible. My mother's face went the color of the yellowed paper in Emmett's tin box. He's dead, she said, meaning Emmett, meaning it as an argument, as though a dead man's paperwork should politely stop mattering once he's not around to defend it. He can't even. This isn't fair, Josephine, this is a technicality. This house has been in this family. It was never in this family, I said. That was the entire point you all kept making every Christmas for 25 years. He wasn't family. Turns out the house agreed with you. My father's outburst came next. Exactly the way I'd have predicted it, if I'd let myself predict things like that. He stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. You'd sue your own father over a piece of land? Over an old man who wasn't even blood? I'm not suing you over land, Dad. I'm reporting a crime you committed while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. There's a difference, and I think you know it, because you waited until I couldn't say no. Chase wouldn't look at me. That was the visible shame. Not an outburst, not tears, just his eyes fixed on the table, his hand flat against the wood like he was trying to hold something down that wanted to come up. Meredith reached over and put her hand on his knee, and I remembered, suddenly, the way she'd looked at him at that Christmas dinner 2 years before. The half-second where she'd almost spoken and hadn't. I wondered if this was the moment that half-second had been building toward the whole time. My mother cried, and it was real, or real enough. The tears were real even if the reason for them wasn't the reason I'd have wanted. She wasn't crying for Emmett. She was crying because the $428,000 was gone, or going, and because a document she'd never respected while its owner was alive had reached out from past his death and undone everything she'd built on top of his silence. I put the tin box on the table in the middle of everyone, lid open. He kept this on the refrigerator for 1.5 years, I said. I used to ask him what he was working on, and he'd tell me it was old business, nothing worth my worrying about. He was protecting me from all of you the whole time, and none of us knew it. And he never once let it cost me a single dinner or a single peaceful night while he was alive to prevent it. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. You used to say boiling toughens everything, I said, though of course it wasn't her line, it was Emmett's, and she didn't know that, and it didn't matter whether she understood it or not. You were wrong. It just breaks things down until there's nothing left of what they used to be. He never let it boil. That's the only reason there's anything left to salvage here at all. The room was quiet for a long time after that. My father sat back down slow, like his knees had finally caught up to the news. Garrett Muncie's lawyer was already talking numbers with Corinne. Rescission of the sale, return of the property, the developer's own claim against my father for fraudulent conveyance, since he'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had in his own way. Justice, when it finally came, looked less like a scene and more like paperwork, which is exactly how it should look if it's real. The sale was voided in full. Garrett Muncie's company got its $428,000 back through a court-ordered settlement drawn against my father's and Chase's assets, since the money had already been split before I woke from surgery. My father lost his half of his own retirement account funding the repayment. Chase sold the truck he'd bought with his share and spent the next 2 years on a payment plan to cover the rest. And to his credit, the one credit I'll give him, he called me 8 months in, not to ask forgiveness, just to say he was sorry plainly, without an angle attached to it. I told him I appreciated the call. I didn't tell him it fixed anything, because it didn't, and I don't believe in pretending it did. I offered my mother one thing, before the final paperwork closed out, Vera's wedding ring, which Emmett had kept in a drawer for years, and which I'd found tucked behind the tin box. I told her she could have it back, no conditions, no apology required. She looked at it in my open palm, and told me she didn't want anything that had been sitting in a dead man's junk drawer. So I kept it. I wear it on a chain now, not my finger, close enough to feel it when I lean over a table. My father never went to prison. The DA's office called it a civil matter that had crossed briefly into criminal territory, and with restitution paid in full and no prior record, he walked away with probation and a debt that will take him the better part of a decade to finish paying off. I understand some people watching this wanted more for him. I've made my peace with proportional instead of satisfying. Emmett would have wanted proportional. He was never a man who believed in taking more than what was owed. I still live in the farmhouse. The Louvier-Vantries family trust holds it now, same as Emmett set it up to, and someday, when I have children of my own, or maybe just a niece who finally calls me back, it'll pass to whoever earns a seat at that table the way he taught me a seat gets earned. Not by blood, but by showing up. Most evenings I still eat at the kitchen table with the comma-shaped burn near the salt shaker. Sometimes I make the dumplings myself now, stock simmering low all afternoon, never boiling because I finally understand what he meant by that. In every sense he meant it. The tin box sits on the shelf above the stove where it always did, empty now of documents. Full instead of the recipe cards I've started keeping in it myself, in my own handwriting, so that whoever eats at this table after me will have something worth passing down besides the deed. If this story meant something to you, here's the only thing I'll ask in return. Call the person in your life who isn't blood but has earned the seat anyway. The step-parent, the family friend, the neighbor who shows up when no one else does. And tell them so today out loud, before it's a eulogy instead of a phone call. Then share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me who your Emmett is. And subscribe if you want more of these. I'll see you in the next one.